So tonight we go back to the beginning, back to 1954 and the Hugo Award-winning novel, the inaugural Hugo winning novel in Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man. So the book takes place in what appears to be a society that is on a tipping point between a utopian or a dystopian future. And we're introduced to the main antagonist in the book in a guy called Ben Reich. Now Ben is this very influential, very powerful man who's ruthless, arrogant, as he is charming and charismatic. And what we find is that Ben has been having nightmares. He's having this reoccurring dream of a man with no face that he's confronted with. And what we find is that Ben's main rival in a guy called Craig de Courtney is starting to threaten Ben's Reich's empire. And in order to minimize his losses, Ben puts out a peace offering in the form of a merger deal. And what we find is that De Courtney, through these coded messages, responds with, yeah, nah, not interested. And that sort of takes Ben on his predetermined view that the only way he can reconcile and minimize his losses is to do away with or murder De Courtney. But that's not going to be an interesting or trivial exercise, because what we find is that this society that Alfred Bester is developed or designed has a rise of a group of people known as espers or peepers. And these espers are people with telepathic capabilities that can read your mind, basically. So what they've done is they've done away with any serious crime, because they can predict a serious crime by reading your thoughts. And these espers are throughout all of society in powerful roles like the police force. So they've effectively abolished crime. So how does one then commit murder in a world where your inner thoughts are transparent to the law enforcement bodies? Well, you know, being the megalomaniac that Reich is, it doesn't deter him in any way. And he goes through with his plans to murder De Courtney. And what we find, in order to protect himself, De Courtney's employed some espers himself, who he has corrupted through promises of power or money. And he's also, you know, deployed this rather interesting jingle, and it's very reminiscent of a 1950s commercial. So he plays this jingle in his head, which I'm not going to repeat it because you'll hate me for it and you'll be singing it for weeks. But he has this jingle that plays in his head, which effectively generates a whole lot of white noise in his head that effectively blocks out Esper's abilities to read his thoughts, because they're just getting all this blast of a jingle and they can't penetrate his thoughts. So he goes through with his plan and he's murdered De Courtney. So at this point we are introduced to the main protagonist in Lincoln Powell. Lincoln is the detective of police. I think he's referred to as the prefect of police, which in essence is just a detective. So we have this detective who's been assigned to the case, but he's not just your ordinary detective. He's what is known as a level 1 esper. So he's one of these espers, telepathic individuals, and he's the cream of the crop. So he's as powerful as they get, and he's been assigned this case and he wants to bring Reich to justice. So what's interesting is right from the beginning, we as the reader know who the murderer is. Powell knows who the murderer is, but he still needs to define motive, opportunity and method. And I think this is where Best has done a great job in this, really what is an inverted detective novel, because he's kept us engaged. So even though we know who the murderer is, we know what guardrails he's put in place to protect himself from these espers, we find this very powerful esper in the detective Lincoln Powell, who's trying to build this case using motive, method and opportunity to bring Reich to justice. But not only does he need to do method, motive and opportunity, but he needs to feed this information, all the evidence that is gathered, into Old Man Mose. And what Old Man Mose is, I'm taking a note because I always forget what it actually stands for. The Mosaic Multiplex Prosecution Computer. So this Old Man Mose, as Powell refers to it, is basically this huge mega computer, which ironically is fed data by using punch cards, so very 1950s reminiscent. But it spits out this verdict as if to say, yes, you have all the evidence in place to be able to convict the person of the charges he's being accused of. So it's rather interesting that I think Best has done a great job in building the tension, building interest in how Powell goes through and gather this motivation and opportunity. So we find Powell needing to input all this data into Old Man Mo's, and it sort of got me thinking about the news of the day. And I'm quite positive that the news of the day must have influenced Alfred Bester when it comes to Old Man Mo's, because what we learn through computer science, if you're a computer scientist out there, is that the first commercial computer system was deployed in America in 1952, and that computer was actually deployed in the Census Bureau in America, and it was codenamed UNIVAC. So I just found too much of a coincidence for it not to be somehow influenced. So I thought that was rather interesting anyway, where we have these punch card computers in a future where we have telepathic capabilities and we've colonized other planets. But, you know, having said that, you know, I found that the novel doesn't feel aged. So even though we're talking about punch card and systems, the thought, you know, around motive, method and opportunity is just as prevalent and just as important it is today as it was in the 1950s. So that's where I think that even though the book has aged in certain areas to do with technology, I think the underlying theme about method, opportunity and motivation is still very much applicable today. So in some ways I found this book not to have aged as much as some of its other contemporaries, nor do I feel it's aged as, you know, like some of the books that we reviewed in the past, like Babel 17. I think Babel 17, to me at least, reads a lot more dated than what The Demolished Man does. So we find Powell punching all this data into this computer system and having to build this case against Powell. And there's a couple of glitches along the way, because like I mentioned, there is a witness in the area here, which sort of makes me want to talk to one of the other things that have aged a little in this book. So there are some female characters in this book, but they are very reminiscent of a 1950s, you know, Hollywood star. So if you can cast your eyes to those black and white movies of the 50s and you think about what the typical female lead and what she would look like and the kind of role they played, I would say you'd be smack bang on the money when it comes to some of the female characters in this book. Now, do I hold that against Alfred Bester? Look, I think Alfred, the fact that he has several female characters in this book is more than some of his contemporaries did in that time frame. So yes, I would like to have seen some stronger female characters in the book. But having said that, he was writing to the audience, his target audience, and he was writing for the times. So look, it's a mild criticism, but I think props to Alfred Bester, because I've just recently read, and I won't mention them, but I've recently read a couple of other 1950s novels over the last couple of weeks that are not on the Hugo and Nebula award-winning books. And there was no sign of a woman at all portrayed in these novels at all. So, like I said, mild criticism, but one that I think probably Bester was ahead of his peers in that, and his contemporaries in that space. So the book talks about demolition and the demolished man, and it talks about this through the whole book. But I don't want to talk about the demolition because it honestly had me on the edge of my seat reading the last couple of chapters to find out exactly what demolition is and what it actually entails. And I don't want to talk about it because I think it'll spoil it for you. But yeah, The Demolished Man, Alfred Bester's, the inaugural Hugo award-winning novel for 1954, and it set the bar really high for his peers and the people that came after him. So look, who would I recommend this book to? The obvious recommendation is to anyone who likes science fiction, who likes science fiction or is interested in science fiction. But the key recommendation for me is if you're into murder mystery novels or detective novels, this is a science fiction detective novel. Murder mystery inverted detective novel. So if you're that way inclined and you really enjoy mystery murder detective novels, then I think you won't be disappointed with The Demolished Man. I don't think it's aged as much as some of his contemporaries, and in some way I think the language that Bester uses, especially in the dialogue, helps a long way in making this book feel current. And you know what also makes it feel current for me is because in a cybersecurity world, you know, the things around motive, method and opportunity are still some of the tools that are implemented today against cyber criminals. So the book has got some really good insights and some timeless principles that don't make it feel dated, in my humble opinion. So yes, recommended book, recommended to anyone who likes sci-fi, murder, mystery, detective novels. I first read this book 25 odd years ago, and you know, honestly, I don't remember too much about it. But what I do recall, and it might be giving away some of my personal psyche on this, but I do recall the nightmare visions that Ben Reich had with the man with no face. So I don't know, there's something spooky about the recurring dream that Ben Reich had, and one that, you know, stuck with me over the years. So look, highly recommend the book. I really did enjoy it. Like I said, I was rather interested in how Bester was able to keep me interested in the novel from the beginning right through to the end. Yeah, really enjoyable read. I hope you enjoyed it as well. But let's take a look how it ranks on our sci-fi shared ladder. So back to the ladder, and let's see where we're going to rank The Demolished Man tonight. Now, maybe we'll start from the top. This list is getting harder and harder every time we look at it. But maybe today we'll start from the top. So, leading the board still, we have Way Station by Clifford Simak, the Hugo Award-winning novel in 1964. And does The Demolished Man top it? Look, in many ways, the books are very similar. But no, I don't think The Demolished Man is better than Way Station. Like I said previously in that review, Way Station just fills you with this sense of awe that is really hard to beat, and I don't think The Demolished Man is quite to that standard. I don't think it's better than To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer, that won the Hugo in 1972. Like I said before, I think Philip really did a great job mixing those non-fictional characters into what is a very memorable book. Definitely not better than The Left Hand of Darkness. That book by Ursula Le Guin is just a wonderfully written novel, worthy of the Hugo and Nebula Award in 1970, and I really can't put The Demolished Man above The Left Hand of Darkness. Is it better than The Flowers of Algernon, the actual novel, not the short story, by Daniel Keyes, that won the Nebula in 1966? It's going to be hard. Maybe let's come back to The Flowers for Algernon. Is it better than Babel 17, the 1966 Nebula Award-winning book by Samuel Delany? Yeah, I think it is. I think The Demolished Man hasn't aged as much as Babel 17 has, at least in my view. I think it's a really well-written book, and I think it's got some timeless themes in there that I would rate it better than Babel 17. So is it going to be between Babel and Flowers, or Flowers and The Left Hand of Darkness? I think I've made my choice, and I'm going to put it right there. The main reason for it is I think The Demolished Man is more of a science fiction novel than what Flowers for Algernon said. If you haven't seen my review for Flowers for Algernon, I highly recommend you view it. But like I said in that review, Flowers for Algernon the only real science fiction element of that book is that we're talking about a surgery that is not yet available today. Apart from that, there's not much science fiction. So just purely because of the science fiction themes in The Demolished Man, I would put it ahead of Flowers for Algernon. So there you go. We're starting to get there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. About another 60 or so to go. But look, it's a joy doing these, and I hope you're enjoying them, and I'll see you next time in the shed.